Thank you, that was embarrassingly generous. I'm from Adelaide, as you might be able to tell. I'm sorry, I'm the one wearing the tie. But speaking of Adelaide, I was on the curfew chaser back to Adelaide one night last week, which of course is just marginally better than the red eye, and reading my Economist when I came across a book review, Sex in the Sea, our intimate connection with sex-changing fish, romantic lobsters, kinky squid, and other salty erotica of the deep. I learned that the cuttlefish are cross-dressers, the male argonaut, a pelagic octopus, has a detachable projectile penis, and dolphins are in flagrante acrobats. Gee, I thought this is something worth conserving. Of course, the book by Maria Hart has a serious message, that because of the heavy human footprint on marine life, even the cleverest underwater sex strategy struggles to succeed. Environmental degradation and overfishing have consequences beyond those obviously apparent. Thus, to review our efforts as custodians of this natural heritage every now and again seems worthwhile, and I therefore accepted this assignment. In recent years, I've focused on the challenges of conservation and sustainable use in international waters under the auspices of the Global Oceans Commission. And I want to focus on that tonight, principally because the high seas, as global commons, have no single state with jurisdictional responsibility and therefore are dependent upon global cooperation, which is something I know a little about. I'll then touch on some more direct responsibilities of Australian policymakers in relation to our immediate marine environment, because to focus on the high seas is not an alternative to our primary responsibility to manage our own marine environment to the highest standards. And I'll entwine a few recommendations along the way. However, I must start with some acknowledgements, and the first is to David Thomas. David believes in the importance of community ownership of conservation issues. The community can drive the solution as much as they might create the problem. That the community must be informed and encouraged to engage. Thus, in addition to all his other generous support for good conservation causes, he sponsors this annual Oration. He is one of Australia's great conservationists, and I commend him. Second, I must acknowledge Ove Goldberg, who introduced me, and who, as you know, is Director of the Global Change Institute at the University of Queensland. It's my privilege to chair the advisory board to the Institute, and its Healthy Oceans program is one of its flagship components. Ove is, of course, one of the world's leading marine scientists, and his commitment to the conservation of coral reef ecosystems is second to none. He also recognises the importance of public information and education, so it's not surprising to me that he's part of tonight's event. It's amazing, however, that he continues to look so young. I can remember him hounding me in the corridors of Parliament House in the late 1980s, determined that the coalition, then in opposition, understood the consequences of climate change on coral reefs, particularly the Great Barrier Reef. And he's still doing it, not to me, but to politicians several generations on. And I saw him doing it recently. But good science is essential to good conservation. And thirdly, I wanted to commend the conservation movement. I'm associated with many of the important players. Pew, WWF and the Australian Wildlife Conservation Society manage this oration. Pew was the principal sponsor of our work in the Global Oceans Commission. I'm pleased to have been close to WWF for many years. I was climate change ambassador for WWF at the Copenhagen COP, so I let them down on that occasion. Others David Thomas supports to help bring about change include the Nature Conservancy, and I'm pleased to be on their Asia Pacific board, and I particularly commend their Great Southern Seascapes project, seeking to restore ecologically important coastal and marine ecosystems. Sounds like blue carbon over. Bush Heritage, the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, led by my former staffer and friend Atticus Fleming, who played such a large role in the design of the EPBC Act and Birds Australia. There are powerful interests on the other side, and David and Thomas and I acknowledge the critically important role the conservation movement plays in challenging those vested interests. And I particularly commend conservation warriors such as Michelle Grady, Imogen Zethoven, Di Tart, the late Felicity Wishart, Michael Kennedy, Alistair Graham, and many others, and those who've helped educate me, particularly Peter Cozier, now Director of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, who's come all the way from Tasmania to be here tonight. The high seas always interested me because being out of sight meant that maybe more damage was being done than we realised, but also being remote might mean that there was a chance to do something before too much damage was done. The Independent Global Oceans Commission was a group of public and private individuals created to help reverse ocean degradation and address failures of high seas governance. The experience of the Commission spanned foreign affairs, finance, education, development and the environment. We were led by Jose Maria Figueres, former President of Costa Rica, Trevor Manuel, former Finance Minister of South Africa, and David Miliband, former Foreign Secretary of the UK, and we were supported in our task by a small but dedicated secretariat at Somerville College, Oxford. We sought the best scientific and economic advice from across the world in an endeavour to find bold, pragmatic, cost-effective and politically feasible proposals to address the major challenges facing the high seas. Unfortunately, we found the oceans to be in a cycle of decline, fanned by benign neglect by the majority and active abuse by the minority. We launched our report, From Decline to Recovery, a rescue package for the global ocean, in the grand but also symbolic setting of the American Museum of Natural History in New York in mid-2014. Our report included 8 recommendations, which we then worked to implement or commence implementation over the next 18 months. We've just issued our final report, The Future of the Ocean, Next Steps and Priorities. We're winding ourselves up, the funders have moved on to new projects, and we will pass the responsibility of further implementation to others. But before I get to the specific recommendations, let me just reflect for a moment on the challenges we face. The ocean covers nearly 3/4 of the world's surface. The high seas cover 64% of the world's oceans, and as I said, lie beyond the jurisdiction of any state. The ecosystems of the high seas do not exist in isolation. They are the ecological hub of the entire marine ecosystem. The health of the high seas affects the whole global ocean, and the health of the global ocean affects us all. The global ocean produces almost half of the oxygen we breathe and absorbs more than 1/4 of the carbon dioxide we emit into the atmosphere. More than 90% of the heat trapped in the Earth's system by greenhouse gas emissions is stored in the ocean. The ocean is, in essence, the kidney of our planet, keeping its ecosystems healthy and productive. But yet we rarely factor these regulating factors into decisions about human activities which affect the health of the ocean. Remember, the 200 nautical mile construct of exclusive economic zones is only a legal construct. What happens in coastal waters affects the health of the high seas, and what happens on the high seas affects the ecological health of coastal waters. I first took these issues to the United Nations in 1999 as Australia's Environment Minister, arguing before the Commission for Sustainable Development that the issue of sustainable use and biodiversity conservation on the high seas should be put on the international sustainability agenda. It was an argument put to me by one or two courageous public servants and supported by my staff. I don't remember support from the Department of Foreign Affairs. We didn't get much support in New York either, but it started a process which has been continuing ever since, and which I'll return in a few minutes. But to focus on the Global Oceans Commission and its 8 recommendations. Our first recommendation was for a stand-alone sustainable development goal for the global ocean, thus putting the global ocean front and centre in the post-2015 UN Development Agenda. We suggested targets, including those that ensure that all fish stocks are being fished sustainably, reforms to protect vulnerable marine areas, including increasing protected areas and increased environmental impact assessments, measures to reduce biodiversity loss, increased efforts to eliminate illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, and measures to reduce the quantity of plastic debris in the marine environment. The standalone SDG, as many of you will know, has been achieved. The goal is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas and marine resources. It mightn't seem extraordinary, but it's the first time that the global community of states has actually agreed to a commitment to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas and marine resources. The targets are, of course, not limited to the high seas, and I want to list the first 6 targets that were agreed by the UN last year, because it's almost as if they were copied from the Global Ocean Committee report, although, of course, it took 3 years of UN deliberation to reach that point. The first, target 14.1, is that by 2025, to prevent and significantly reduce marine pollution of all kinds, particularly from land-based activities, including the marine debris of nutrient pollution. And I'll refer to the challenge of reducing nutrient pollution affecting the Great Barrier Reef from land-based sources when I get to the Australian part of this address. Target 14.2, by 2020, sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems to avoid significant adverse impacts, including by strengthening their resilience, and take action for their restoration in order to achieve healthy and productive oceans. Resilience I'll come back to as well. Target 14.3, minimise and address the impacts of ocean acidification, including through enhanced scientific cooperation at all levels. And this, of course, raises the elephant in the room, carbon pollution. Our report, in fact, referred to the deadly trio of accelerating acidification, ocean warming and deoxygenation. Target 14.4, by 2020, effectively regulate harvesting and end overfishing, illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing practices, and implement science-based management plans to restore fish stocks in the shortest time feasible, at least to levels that can produce maximum sustainable yield as determined by their biological characteristics. 14.5, by 2000, to conserve at least 10% of coastal and marine areas consistent with national and international law and based on best available scientific information. And I know that MPAs are close to the heart of many here tonight. 14.6, by 2020, prohibit certain forms of fishing subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and eliminate subsidies that contribute to overfishing and refrain from the introduction of new such subsidies. So this is, as I say, historic. It's certainly in UN terms historic. Not only has the international community agreed a goal in relation to conservation of the oceans, but it's also agreed a series of hugely demanding targets. The next phase are the indicators against which progress will be measured, and we're still waiting on the UN to complete that task. But accountability is critically important. As Ove would say, monitoring, measurement, analysis and reporting. Only then will we have confidence that it's heading from aspirations towards a better outcome. Nevertheless, the commitment by the global community is a big step forward, and we on the Global Oceans Commission were particularly pleased. The second recommendation of the Global Oceans Commission was to strengthen ocean governance arrangements. In particular, we called for a new implementing agreement under UNCLOS on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, and this was the issue that I took to the UN so many years before. Last year, UNGA, UN General Assembly, decided, after 9 years of the ad hoc, informal, etc., committee, to establish a preparatory committee to make substantive recommendations on the element of a draft text of a legally binding instrument. There's still a long way to go, but if agreeing SDGs was historic, this is momentous. For example, a legally binding protocol under UNCLOS would be expected to provide for environmental impact assessments and marine protected areas on the high seas. And I would like to think that the Global Oceans Commission played ever so small a part in persuading the US to move on the issue, which was crucial to last year's progress. Many thought this was an impossible task, but persistence is essential in ocean conservation. On oceans governance, we also called for universal ratification of UNCLOS and the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, and the establishment of an annual meeting of state parties to ANSFA to provide a platform for greater accountability. This remains work in progress, but it's worth continuing. We called for regular independent assessment of regional fisheries management organisations, RFMOs, to improve their performance. Also work in progress, but definitely must remain on the agenda. Our dream would be to convert regional fisheries organisations to regional ocean management organisations. Our ultimate goal is for an ecosystem-based management on a regional basis rather than sectoral-based arrangements. The ocean simply doesn't work that way. We also argued for prompt entry into force of the FAO Port State Measures Agreement of 2009, and here again progress has been made, with a further 9 states joining, including Australia, since the launch of our report. We're not quite there yet, we need another 6 states, but with continuing effort, this should be achieved. Back in the days when I focused on IUU fishing of Patagonian toothfish in the sub-Antarctic, we found that port state measures to be one of the most effective tools in combating this threat. We also advocated for the appointment of a special representative for the oceans by the Secretary-General of the United Nations. The oceans need high-level political advocacy, which doesn't presently exist. In the same vein, we urged the appointment of ocean envoys or ministers by heads of state or governments, and there's been some movement around the world in that direction. Our third recommendation was to call on the WTO to address the issue of harmful fishing subsidies. This was very much in the spirit of what turned out to be SDG 14.6. Fishing subsidies currently amount to about $30 billion per year globally, 60% of which it's estimated encourage unsustainable, destructive and even illegal fishing practices. Unfortunately, we were unable to get the issue of fishing subsidies on the agenda of the 10th WTO Ministerial Conference at the end of last year, as we'd hoped, despite the support of a number of states. So this remains work in progress. The fourth GOC recommendation related specifically to IUU fishing. And again, it's not dissimilar to that in the new SDG. The question is how to achieve the goal. And I've mentioned the value in ratifying the Port State Measures Agreement and also in eliminating harmful subsidies. We also recommended that the International Maritime Organisation extend mandatory tracking devices for merchant ships to also cover fishing vessels fishing on the high seas. We received some encouragement for this, but the change is yet to occur. We would also like to see states and RFMOs banned at-sea transshipment of fish. What we really want is a global information sharing platform for real-time sharing of data on high seas fishing vessels and their activities so as to deter IUU fishing and to promote traceability. With the help of organisations such as Google, what seemed impossible a short while ago is now becoming achievable. And this would be an exciting development and contribution to achieving that recommendation. Our fifth recommendation addressed the issue of marine pollution. Persistent organic pollutants, hydrocarbons, heavy metals, nitrates, radioactive substances, marine debris, but particularly plastics. And I recently saw one prediction that by 2050, the weight of plastics in the ocean will exceed the weight of fish. I'm told that in 2012, plastic production globally was 0.28 billion tonnes, but by 2050, it's expected to be 33 billion tonnes. So this issue is just not going to go away. We suggested a range of measures to stem the flow of plastics to the waterways and expediting the transition to a circular economy. But to be frank, apart from raising the profile of the issue, there was not much we could do. Perhaps a little encouraging was that in June of last year, in the G7 Leaders' Declaration, there was agreed an action plan to combat marine litter, which places an emphasis on plastics. Also, closer to home, the New South Wales government, I noticed, to introduce container deposit legislation. If I might say with respect, that would be good. It would be good if Queensland did so as well. And actually, now the minister, well, it's a pity the minister's not here, but it was nice of him to come to the reception. I would have liked to suggest to him that he might look at landfill levies as well. Our sixth recommendation concerned the need for universally agreed environmental and safety standards for offshore drilling on the continental shelf, and it's probably self-evident and I won't dwell on it tonight. Our seventh recommendation, however, was novel and I would suggest important, and it's a matter of regret to me that we're unable to see it realised. We called for the establishment of an independent global ocean accountability board. It was to measure progress against our recommendations and report accordingly. But with the adoption of the SDGs, we remodelled that concept to measure progress in achieving the sustainability goals. And we think that independent measurement and assessment is still vitally important. We're a little encouraged in that the UN General Assembly has decided to convene the first high-level UN conference on oceans and seas in Fiji in June of 2017. And in the words of the resolution, the conference is to be supported by an independent benchmarking mechanism. So we might get a little of what we wanted, although from what I know about the pace of change in the UN, it's hard to imagine that that would be set up and working and reporting by the first conference in 2017. Our last recommendation, maybe from a certain sense of desperation, was that if the cycle of degradation was not being reversed in, say, 5 years, the international community of states should consider turning the high seas with the exception of those where RFMO action is effective, which is not too many, into a regeneration zone where industrial fishing is prohibited. I see Imogen nodding. However, I hope we don't get to the test because I can't imagine the degree of international consensus that would be necessary to put that initiative into practice. Before I get to the responsibilities within national jurisdictions, I wanted to briefly address the overarching challenge of climate change resulting from anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. We were constantly reminded by the scientists of the link between ocean health and climate health and the relevance of greenhouse gas emissions to all 8 of our recommendations. And whilst we didn't choose to double up on the work of the UNFCCC, we were obviously pleased that in Paris last December, the first global agreement to reduce greenhouse gases was reached. We're also pleased that a group of governments, including Australia and other interests, called for an IPCC report on the ocean climate interface. It's something that we need to understand better, and I congratulate O for the part he played in convincing global leaders that this was a scientific priority. Still to be agreed, of course, but we're working in the right direction. So I hope it's evident that, despite the frustrations, that I do think that we might be reaching a turning point. Just enough has occurred in the last year or so to give me some optimism. I concede, however, that it's a long way from the rarefied air of the conference room in New York or Paris to nutrient outflows on the Great Barrier Reef or trying to combat the crown of stars without the thorn starfish. Every challenge we face in relation to the high seas is, of course, exacerbated in coastal waters. The consequences of overfishing, global warming, acidification, pollution, land-source nutrient flows, and other human interventions have greater adverse consequences than on the high seas. Yet our first charge remains to meet our own jurisdictional responsibilities of conservation and sustainable use. However, from my experience, even determining jurisdictional responsibility in Australia is not straightforward. The EPBC Act, as was said, was of course not only the first piece of Commonwealth environmental law to give the Federal Environment Minister the power and responsibility to make decisions, but also sought to clarify responsibility in relation to matters of national environmental significance, particularly responsibilities that arose from the Commonwealth entering into international environmental conventions. In the theatre of politics, this was not widely welcomed by the states, but it is important that the Commonwealth does meet its treaty responsibilities. In fact, the Act has enabled the Commonwealth to be more proactive than would have previously been the case in the marine environment. Having said that, the states remain important players, and a cooperative relationship with the states and the Commonwealth will always yield the best outcomes. But to repeat, the Commonwealth should not abrogate its responsibility in order to win that cooperation. We tried to get the balance right. I would have liked to have seen climate change listed as a matter of national environmental significance, but that in those days was seen as a step too far in terms of intruding into the state's land use responsibilities. Nevertheless, as was said, the policy construct of the National Representative System of Marine Protected Areas was given legislative authority under the EPBC Act with a systematic, ecologically representative and science-based approach, which enabled the creation of 20 marine parks under the Howard government. Another 36 were declared by the subsequent Labor governments under this policy. Together they comprise Australia's Commonwealth Marine Reserves network, and I congratulate all who have contributed to this historic achievement, which includes many who are here tonight. Ongoing debates in relation to the management plans continue, and conservation warriors must remain alert. It was ever so. I understand that we're tracking very well against SDG 14.4 in relation to area targets. When the indicators are released, it will be interesting to see how we rate on a qualitative basis. It would be cheeky for me to surmise that the UN Statistics Division might have looked at the EPBC criteria or the criteria upon which the GPR Representative Area Program was developed in their search for world's best practice. Similarly, in relation to fishing, the EPBC Act enabled the Federal Environment Department to undertake an ecological assessment of not just Commonwealth-managed fisheries, but also state-managed fisheries where product was exported. I gather that the process has slipped a bit in the implementation, which illustrates that good law will never be sufficient without good administration. On the vexed issue of EPBC assessments, we did provide for a streamlined process. We did not want to see duplication. In my view, proponents have the right to clarity of the rules and a cost-efficient and timely process. The EPBC Act can be administered in that way, incorporating matters of national environmental significance into regional planning and expanding and improving the quality of strategic assessments would allow win-win outcomes. And I hear that New South Wales might be moving in this direction, and I hope that others will follow. When some of us, a few of us anyway, last week celebrated the 20th anniversary of the election of the Howard government, I was a bit disappointed that environmental reforms were not listed as one of the significant achievements of that era. As I travel the world, the EPBC Act is still referred to as best practice environmental law. It remains important in the quest to achieve good conservation and sustainable use outcomes in relation to Australia's marine environment, at least until someone devises a better law. Generally speaking, Australia is well regarded when it comes to dealing with these complex, multi-jurisdictional, cross-sectoral natural resource management issues. Whether it's managing the Murray-Darling Basin or management of the Great Barrier Reef, these are challenging assignments. We tend to go through periods of crisis and come out the other side. We've done it in the case of the Murray-Darling Basin, and we can do it again with the reef. It may not have been a pretty process, but outlawing the dumping of dredging spoil from industrial developments in the World Heritage Area is a good reform, and I'm a bit embarrassed that it didn't occur in my time. But then I had the reform of the trawl plan, not dissimilar, in that it took a lot to convince stakeholders that excessive prawn trawling on the sands, miles from the reef, was in fact a threat to the reef. It takes good science, information and education, a firm resolve, and money. I'm not an expert, but listening to experts, I'm told that the principal threats to the reef now arise from temperature rise and acidification, increased sediment and nutrients from land-based sources, and damage from more intense cyclones, probably associated with climate change. As a result of these and historical factors such as overfishing, the reef is not as resilient as it once was. These are difficult issues, I would think more difficult than regulating tourism or even commercial fishing. The climate change action of any one state won't reverse global warming, although all states must play their part. However, the sediment and nutrient issue can be addressed at source. No matter who has jurisdictional responsibility, that will require real leadership and cooperation, both by the Commonwealth and the state of Queensland. It's important the water quality targets in the Reef Plan 2050 are translated into a process that gives us confidence that they will be achieved. And I suspect this will require both regulation and economic support. This challenge also might still require a little encouragement from the conservation warriors. In the meantime, I'd like to see reform of the governance of Gaboompa, separating the function of governance from executive responsibility was a good idea at the time I was Minister, but I was not able to achieve the reform. Commonwealth-state cooperation didn't go that far. It's still a good idea. I compensated with a workaround, appointing the late Virginia Chadwick as chair, and I'm sure that there have been subsequent workarounds, but it's not a difficult reform and it should be implemented. It would similarly be useful if Gabrumpa reported directly to the Commonwealth and Queensland parliaments and that there was parliamentary oversight. Similarly, it would be very important that the 2019 GBR Outlook report is produced without fear or favour and to the highest standard. Gabrumpa must be properly structured, financed and empowered to meet its demanding responsibilities. Finally, reference was made in the introduction to Oceans Policy and National Oceans Office, the National Oceans Office, which we established when I was Environment Minister. Other portfolios, particularly industry and agriculture, didn't like it. The states didn't like it. Many in the private sector didn't like it. So it probably wasn't difficult for it to be allowed to pass away. But I thought it was a good reform, encouraging a better understanding of both the resource and natural heritage importance of one of the largest and most complex maritime assets in the world, and encouraging integrated management and conservation decisions. Interestingly, the conceptual basis to it was not very different to some of the outcomes that we reached in our work 15 years later in the Global Oceans Commission. I know governments don't go backwards, but I hope a future government will invent the next generation ocean policy and National Oceans Office. I again thank David Thomas for encouraging public debate in this field, and I thank all those committed to ocean futures.